So welcome to all to this roundtable dedicated to PV, energy, and biodiversity, and what ERC levers for exemplary innovative projects to reduce impacts on biodiversity. We're going to touch upon three major subjects, which I'm going to show you if this works. So we're going to speak about the impacts, the known impacts of these PV substations on biodiversity. We're going to talk about some innovative ERC measures that are important that you need to understand and manage. And the question is, how do we follow up on these measures and how they're applied and what tools are used? I'm Carol Rapp. I'm a journalist specialized in energy transition. And to speak about this, I've got four specialists. So, Thomas Aiglin, the coordinator of the Soils, Landscapes, and Environmental Impacts Division.
Bonjour, Thomas. Je vous en prie. Donc, coordinateur du pôle.
Who is the coordinator of the Soils, Landscapes, and Environmental Impacts within ADEM's Bioeconomy and Renewable Energies Department. Manon Léon de Trevoret, who is the ecologist project manager for the environmental consulting firm Biotope in Bourgogne-Franche-Comté. Robin Dixon, head of environmental expertise for the France Renewables Association, who is also the spokesperson for renewable electrical energy in France. And finally, Sophie Jacot, who is the head of environmental monitoring for the photovoltaic energy producer, Photosol, who created a biodiversity division 2 years ago. As I said, but for those who have just arrived, you can ask your questions via the Slido application. To do so, just flash the QR code, scan the code that's up there on the screen. You can zoom in from the back of the room. It works. You open the application and you can ask your questions directly, and we'll answer them at 2 points during the conference, right about in the middle in 30 minutes, and then at the end another Q&A, so in less than an hour. Or potentially, sometimes, if a question is very precisely focused on something we're speaking of. So we're going to start with the impacts of ground-mounted solar power plants on biodiversity. Thomas, from ADEM. So there's an observatory of renewable energy and biodiversity created in April 2024, so it's been a year and a half. How is our understanding of the impact of these solar power plants on biodiversity evolving? Are there any new impacts discovered in recent years?
Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone. So I co-manage the observatory, whose objective is to understand the scientific knowledge and these impact and the efficiency of these solutions in order to reach these objectives. So we and a number of partners do so, and we need to keep in mind the research is recent in terms of impact on biodiversity. Especially, we've got to have a site where we can evaluate all this. So we're gaining knowledge currently, but we need to continue to research. What we already know, when we implant a ground-mounted solar power plant, it generates pressure on biodiversity at two levels, at two scales. On the landscape, so multiple hectares that are closed off, and this can create fractions and affect the ecology. The second scale, within the power plant itself, on the panels, between the panels, we change the landscape, we change the amount of water going into the soil, the amount of light getting to the soil. So there will be work that needs to be carried out to manage the vegetation so that we create habitable conditions. So this pressure generates an impact.
Ces impacts, ils peuvent être au
These
niveau du sol,
impacts
au
can
niveau
be
de la
on the
flore,
soil, on
au niveau de la
flora,
faune,
on
la faune,
fauna,
la petite faune, et également au niveau de tout ce qui se nourrit de cette petite faune.
and everything that feeds off this, for example,
Alors, on a quand même
birds.
voulu, dans le cadre de l'observatoire, faire
In
le
the
point de toute la
observatory, we
littérature
wanted to understand all the existing scientific literature. I don't know if you can read what I put up
d'essayer
here.
de vous traduire ça. On travaille avec
We
le Muséum
work
d'histoire naturelle,
with the Museum of Natural History,
basé en face de la
based
galerie de l'évolution.
in front of the Gallery of
Et dans le
Evolution.
métier, c'est de traiter les données
And
de
we try
biodiversité
to
en
look
France
at
et
the
d'évaluer
data
les
for
impacts des
biodiversity
espèces.
and
On a
evaluate the
regardé
impact.
tout ce qu'il y a dans la littérature
So we
scientifique.
looked at everything that was in the
Qu'est-ce que vous
scientific
pouvez dire sur les
literature
impacts des centrales photovoltaïques
and
au
what
sol?
was the impact of these
Ils ont regardé plusieurs centaines de
power plants.
publications. Ils en
We
ont
looked at
identifié
many
une cinquantaine
published
qui étaient
articles. We identified
exploitables, avec des
50 that were
données
usable
Donc, à peu près
and that had
800
important
observations.
data.
Ils ont
So
donc commencé à dire
800
des
different
choses sur,
observations.
la flore et
And
le
we can
sol.
start talking about
La première
flora
chose qu'ils ont observé,
and
c'est qu'il
insects.
y a une grande
The first
variabilité.
thing is that there's huge variability.
Il y a une modification
There is a
dans le fait de mettre
modification
en place, des panneaux au sol,
because we are
principalement
putting
des
these solar
panneaux
panels on the ground.
sur les communautés végétales. Elles sont
On the
modifiées.
vegetal community,
Ça, c'est
they're
la
modified.
partie en vert. Donc
That's
là où
what
on
you see in
compare, moi, je vous ai
green.
mis la comparaison,
And you can see
zone
the
ouverte entre les
comparison,
panneaux. On
so
voit
if
déjà
there's
des
an
effets.
open area or
Et
not.
on voit un effet légèrement
And we
négatif
see
sur
that
les
there's a
insectes.
negative
Donc, on
effect on
modifie,
insects.
de manière variable
So
la communauté
we're
végétale.
modifying variably the vegetal community, and as a chain reaction,
Les plantes à fleurs.
we're going to reduce the amount of flowers, and for example, the nectar, and then we reduce pollinators. That's what we see in the scientific literature.
Négatif sur
So there's a negative effect
pollinisateurs.
on these pollinators, notably, and variability in the flora. And then there's a variation, we can extrapolate from that, does that not affect bats and birds? But we have some research carrying out a study that was published today
Par le Muséum d'histoire naturelle.
by the Natural History
l'utilisation
Museum
d'espace dans les centrales photovoltaïques par les
on the
chlorophylles. On voit une réduction sur les centrales
reduction
photovoltaïques. Donc il peut y avoir un effet en chaîne.
in
Maintenant, la question, c'est de bien
some
comprendre
of these
ce qui se passe
insects.
et de
But we need to
pouvoir
understand what's happening, and we need to identify solutions to limit them. So we saw a little bit in the literature, in the scientific literature, we saw a slight amount that trackers
en moyenne nulle par rapport
have very little effect to these mounted panels. That's one of my questions. You're talking about these ground-mounted, but when we're talking about environmentalism, do we see other more specific impacts? So trackers. For agrivoltaics, this is a recent sector, so we have even less data. We can imagine that the idea of working on shading and reducing rain would encourage biodiversity. And we're often put in place in rural agricultural areas. So that's what we think, but we don't have a lot of data. There's some research carried out in the US when we install one of these parks in a cultivated area and it becomes a prairie that can encourage the breeding of certain types of birds and bats on these prairies. So that would have a positive, it could be a positive impact. That's interesting. Thank you. So I'm going to hand over to Robin from France Renewables. Over the years, we've been getting more and more information about the impact of these power plants. How is the photovoltaic industry responding to this? And in particular, how has it evolved in terms of taking the ERC sequence into account? So avoid, reduce. The sequencing is avoid, reduce, and that's been happening since 1916, which is the basis for all of our projects, including renewable projects. So first, to avoid the impacts as much as possible. Those that we can't avoid, we reduce, and the others, we compensate. An important evolution in the sector in the last few years as regards this. We have been planted more and more farms, solar farms, and we've tested things. But what's important is that the sector has reinforced their expertise by recruiting specialists within the development. And that's important because today, developers that are the most serious are, in terms of environmental aspects, those who are specialists in the long term, those who have worked in this area for the long term, those who can therefore analyze and challenge the studies, find better measures, speak with consultants on the environment, and that's how we're making progress in general. As concerns other good practices and the evolution of this sector, we've got this kind of realization by those who are funding all the different organizations that finance these projects. They look at the quality of the project's environmental impact, because then it has a direct impact on how much money they can make, on its profits. So if we have a project that's exemplary for the environment, it's less risk. It can be less legal risks. We don't, if there's a species that is been affected, they avoid that risk. When the power plant is operating, there's a good profitability because we don't need to add new environmental measures when we're already up and running. So taking this into consideration at the initial stages is so important to be sure that the park throughout its lifespan is exemplary in terms of the environment and easier to manage for the person overseeing it in terms of PV at least. We don't want the park to have to evolve when it's already up and running. We can stop it running at certain point. But once the park is there, once the farm is there, we want it to be running smoothly. We want it exemplary from the beginning, so that behind that we can make other decisions, and we'll talk about that in the third part. Thank you. So we're going to see how we use these measures directly. Sophie, when we were sort of planning on this roundtable, you named different actions, and one that seems obvious but isn't is creating measures and rules. And why is that important? These instructions, these measures that we have to put into place, we know that people who think and imagine that these measures are not necessarily the operators of these farms. So the teams that build these things and the operators have different objectives, costs, deadlines. They're not experts or specialists in biodiversity. So, for example, one person putting in this project asked me, do I need to respect measures for avoiding or reducing? What do I do? And they're not specialists and experts in biodiversity, and it's not easy for them. And yet, I still see impact studies that are 400 pages long, which is huge, and the measures are completely lost in this huge text. So we need a chapter dedicated to the measures taken at the end of the impact study, and measures that are clear, direct, and translated into a readable language so that an operator can directly understand it and take it into consideration and apply it. And the more quickly we understand, the more quickly it can be applied. There's also a question of funding. Yeah, you mustn't forget quantification of CapEx and OpEx. The instant cost is often underestimated by the consulting firm because they're not asking for the quote. They don't have them in their hand. It's those that are developing. And recurring costs for maintenance and measures are often forgotten or minimized. And yet, in a pile of wood, we need to understand its composition. We've got do we need to bury it? Avoiding nests need to be maintained. So you must not underestimate the cost of maintenance. If you don't plan to have that budget from the beginning, then it's very complicated to do so later. You spoke about it, but when these parks are being developed, we've got to apply these measures by subsidiaries or service providers. Yes, if there's a key message today, it's that that biodiversity is not just one person's problem, not just the project leader, not just the developer. It's everyone's issue. For these measures to work, they have to be appropriated by the entire, in every step of the process. To do so, subcontractors or developers need to understand easily what they need to do or not do. This takes place by creating these different avoid, reduce, compensate measures with our service providers. Use simple language so that everyone can understand it. We can also add penalties if we miss certain measures, or it can be symbolic, but I feel like this will continue to build awareness to biodiversity and influence these biodiversity projects. So awareness, so that subcontractors understand what we're talking about, but again, we have to speak their language so that they understand what we do or what we don't do. And the risk, if we get too technical from the consulting firm, then we'll lose them, and it's like they'll be sleeping at the back of the class, just like in high school. And follow-up on these sites is really important. I welcome the developers to call upon consulting firms that worked on these at the initial stages to come and do follow-up on the fauna and flora, to have a strategy of continuous improvement. If they see on site what's working and what's not working, then they'll also be able tomorrow to suggest measures that are more adapted, easily applicable, and better for the projects of tomorrow. And for those who are in charge of developing these sites, do you think they're more aware of these questions? Yes, of course. As Robin said, the people working in these companies are aware, and then they're able to teach the other peoples in their team and continue with the awareness campaign. I'm going to hand over to Manon from Biotop, which is another subject. So speaking about avoid, reduce, and compensate measures, which is the question of fencing, which is a big challenge for biodiversity. These solar power plants are fenced in. It's for insurance purposes, but obviously certain animals need to be able to pass through the fences. How do we do this? And is it efficient? Yes, so why are we interested in the fencing? We're focused on the issues of fragmentation of habitat, which can be impacted due to fencing. Okay, and so the Grenelle of the Environment committed to green and blue laws to be focused on this permeable fence situation. There's different moments where we can intervene in the thought process. First of all, creating a space between the fence, so allowing larger animals to move through these fences. We recommend 10 to 20 meters between the solar power panel and the fence. Where I'm from, we recommend 10 meters. Then on the edge of the farm and the fence. And then we've got to think about the map of this fence, to not have a huge farm fenced in, but have more like a patch. So looking at the pathways and create patches of fencing so that the farms that are under 25 hectares and have the possibility to maintain these pathways between parcels, and reinforce this fencing with hedges that will encourage all of these different animals to move through these areas and encourage passage for bats. And how do we conceive of all this? What fence do we choose? We've got to choose fencing with large spaces, 20 centimeters to 20 centimeters. For example, the hedgehog of Europe, or the hare, another type of hare here in Europe, which is the animals we see regularly in these farms. And from the feedback we've had, it works. We had a farm where there was this rabbit in the Garenne, and we still see that same rabbit living within this farm. It's also lifting up the fence from 20 to 30, 40 centimeters from the ground to encourage permeability. So these are choices you have to make. The fence can also be an ecological trap for certain species. So we've got to choose those that are the most solid and rigid so that animals don't get stuck in them. This is very, very important. For example, different types of small animals can get stuck in more flexible fencing. So it has to be rigid and solid. We also need to avoid everything that's pillars that are hollow. Little critters can get inside because they think it's a safe place to hide, birds as well. Seagulls, squirrels, reptiles can get stuck in these. So we ask that these pillars be covered at the top and not be hollow. Thank you for all these very clear examples, and we're going to continue by working on concrete measures. Sophie from Photosol. During the construction and then operational phases, one of the challenges is invasive alien plants. How can their proliferation be prevented, and what are the risks? Yes, who's never shook when your ecologists announced that they saw some invasive plant? It's quite dangerous. So these exotic invasive species grow quickly, they spread fast, and it's very difficult, even though we don't have all the techniques are not well known, operational, or efficient. And also the machines can bring in seeds and then disseminate them. So the biggest struggle we have is the evolution between the initial size and the species that were first identified, and then huge construction sites that are covered in these new species. I'll give you a very clear example on a construction site that I followed. We had a landscaper that was hired for these invasive species. The issue is that they were not autonomous to identify these species, so I was often looking at untreated areas and a lack of information by the adherent services. So with the expert ecologists, we came to look at the identification, the exhaustive identification of these plants, but it's complicated because we needed, everyone's schedule had to match up, and of course it doubled the cost. So then we changed service providers to have a landscaper who was much more interested in biodiversity and then much more autonomous to identify these species, and most importantly, had good practices. He came at the right time of the year and also was able to remove them correctly. So what we did with this partner, we had a daily contract. No matter what happened, every month he comes to the site, he looks to see if there's any of these species. If there are none, he still bills us. However, if he does see them and there's a treatment, then he'll bill us for the removal. And finally, for these exotic and invasive species, what's the most complex is certain species that are in network. I have no miracle solution. We had a site that was about 100 square meters, and in the impact study, it's written that the root system is over 3 meters, which is 300 cubic meters. I got a 500,000 euro quote, and of course that's unacceptable for the company. And if just one part of the root of this plant remains, then it will affect the entire parcel. So we have special material brought in, but it's difficult to find. And then we thought about putting tarps down, but this Japanese plant was really under the solar panel, so you can't tarp a solar panel. So now we're trying to find a solution to electrocute these roots. The issue now is it compatible with our PV installations, which are electric, of course? And why not also have certain animals that could come and eat this invasive species? That's really interesting for people working. I'm sure you're full of information, but we're going to continue with Manon at Biotop. Can you give us other examples of reduction measures during the operational phase for agrovoltaic parks, because I think where you're from, you have quite a few parks. I just wanted to remind you that measures of reduction are great, but as Robin said, avoiding is the first measure to put in place to avoid this happening in sensitive areas, maybe avoiding certain types of plants, avoiding in the operational phases, in the construction phases. We know that in operational phases we won't be able to remove it, so this has to happen at the construction site. Also, everything that's humid wetlands, we need to avoid them. We know that compensation in these areas is very complicated. You need a lot of land. The compensatory measures are difficult to put in place, and it will always be less expensive to avoid these areas rather than compensating for them. You must keep that in mind. And to reduce the reductive measures for the consumption of the park, we've got to encourage. In agrovoltaics, we have a culture. So what's in between the panels, sometimes the space in between these panels is 10 meters, and we know that the larger space between the panels, the more biodiversity will thrive. So keeping these interspaces large is important. Everything that's reducing in terms of the choice of panel, there's an issue for insects or aquatic birds that are attracted to polarized light of the panels. So choosing a surface that's not smooth, the conservatory, the national advice for nature protection recommended in 2024 a white grid system on the panels, just a few lines per panel, in order to limit this polarized light effect. So that can be a choice in terms of which solar panel. For bats, on trackers, we know that at night these trackers are horizontal, so we want to keep them at an angle of at least 30 degrees so that the bats don't think that it's a surface covered in water and come into collision with the panel. So these are choices, well-accepted choices. When I speak to this to project leaders, these are pretty traditional measures and that are easily put in place. So it's these measures that need to be taken. As concerns the construction steps and phases, really look at the calendar to avoid destroying protected species when you're at the construction phase, because this is the most critical time for biodiversity. And when then you're operating an agrivoltaics, everything concerning grazing, have a grazing plan. The areas must not be overgrazed to maintain the prairie system that with the most amount of flowers as possible to attract the highest amount of insects. And so, then it's all the predators, birds will then also be able to come into the park. And then when you're creating a grazing plan, you want to avoid worming of these sheep or cows in the spring to ensure that insects that are then coming in eating the waste of these animals are poisoned, and then, of course, poison bats and birds who feed off the insects. So this is also something that needs to be taken into consideration, because there was no grazing before, so there's definitely going to be an impact if we don't think about the entire life cycle.
So I'm just going to take advantage, because there are a number of questions for you, and we'll come on to the rest afterwards. One of the questions is, you talked about the slope of the panels. Do you have any scientific publications on angles of under 30 degrees that you could recommend? Yes, this comes from a Hungarian study that was made. But these publications are done in situ, so not really on the panels themselves, but they looked at that problem, they saw that smooth surfaces, and they took plexiglass to represent the panels. And this was also in the LAPO report. So this is something that is well known. And we must also avoid vertical panels, like we can see in the States sometimes, where there's a real barrier effect. Thank you. Other questions on fences, but I'll ask these later on. But I'm going to pass the floor to Sophie from Photosol. We're now going to talk about compensation measures. For example, recreating a pond or grassland on another plot of land. This is also problematic. So what are the challenges linked to compensation measures? Yes, I would like to insist on the land aspect, which is the greatest issue that we have for the implementation of compensation measures. First of all, because it's very time-consuming, and also because it's very costly. And in particular, I would like to stop on the mechanism of obligations that are required by the instructing services. But on the other side of the mirror, there are a lot of problems and cash to implement these. So it's a mechanism that has been around since 2016, but very few notaries have actually worked on this. So when we ask them to help us with it, they find out all about it at the same time as us. So it's complicated. It takes time because they have to do the research themselves. There are also a whole series of documents, of appendices and land documents that we have to find and to gather together and annex to the document. And the signers of this are sometimes worried about the legal and administrative responsibility they might have if ever there's a failure on behalf of the project manager. So we need to reassure them on this side. And also, we need to identify a co-contractor. Not everybody can sign as a co-contractor. There is a defined list of entities that can do this, and we must manage to convince them of the quality of our project so that they put their signature next to ours. So in Photosol, we drew inspiration from the amphitheotic, the 100-year leases that are used in the sector. So we worked on promises that we signed quickly, and this allowed us to set in writing the intentions of commonly managing the system, and above all, crystallizes the cost, because there's a fierce negotiation on compensation, and it needs to be put in writing. And then once all of the conditions are gathered together with an identified co-contractor and the documents, then we sign the final contract with the notary. Another element I would like to underline is the difficulty that we have in Photosol, because often we have compensatory measures that are for the owners and farmers. So they say, this is my land, I do what I want, I don't want there to be a foreigner, in inverted commas, meaning that takes the measurements for us, and therefore we're kind of have to contract with them to create and manage the measurements, and there is no competition. So sometimes the quotes are very high, and we spent a lot of time negotiating to have a reasonable price to have all of these measurements taken, and they live from their farming. They have a turnover generated by wheat crops or other, so they're out in the field working the land, and we're running after them so that they think about doing the measurements afterwards. So yes, the measurements of the grassland, for example, and a lot of compensation measures that are possible also. But it's not their priority on the farm. So the problem is that we can't upset them, because as they are owners, well, we count on them so that we can implement the compensation measures. So I don't have any miracle solutions. If not, we can decorrelate the land problems. So if the owner has a compensation that's defined for possible loss of value of the land and the lack of agricultural income, and also to sign a paid service compensation, with penalties in case they do not implement the measures correctly. Well, thank you very much. We're now going to move on to the first session of questions and answers. So there's a comment to those. So first of all, the questions. These are particularly for Manon. So in the recommendations, so the distance between the fence and the first rows, where do the 10 and 20 meters come? What scientific data do you have? Well, this comes from the manual published by the OFB, which dates back to 2023-2024. So it is among the recommendations. But there is no scientific in-depth study, but it is part of this handbook. Another question on fences. Is it preferable for the wildlife to raise the fence or to create wildlife passageways if we had to make a choice? I think that the choice would be to raise the fence, because we know that creating wildlife passages means making holes in the fences. This is something that needs to be monitored. You know, when we look at the work site, that this is implemented by the subcontractor. But I think the most easy thing is to choose the fences with 20 by 20 links, and if we can, to raise the fence. But I think, first of all, it is the size of the webbing of the fence, then raise the fences, and then make the holes. So we need to, in order for that to work, we need to look at where the animals, what their route is. So it's less difficult, it's less easy than to change fencing that the wildlife can get through. Just to comment on that, for the fences, you have to be careful about the risk of trapping the animals within the production unit. So we've had some cases when we raise the fences, the wild boar dig underneath, they get into the unit, and then they can't get out again. And so you need to think in that way as well. So today what a lot of developers and operators do is that they take the motorway fences and they put them upside down with the big holes at the bottom and the little ones at the top, and or the other way around. And so it prevents the large animals from being able to get in. So if there are sheep in there, for example, it would prevent the wolves from coming in. So for Robin, is there scientific documents on the impact of PV solar panels on roofs on biodiversity? Well, we looked for this, but there isn't a lot of information. It's a subject that people don't really talk about. But generally, the subjects related to roof PV and biodiversity is that it's the same for building renovations, the renovation of roofs. The LPO created a guide on taking biodiversity into account in building renovations, which I think can be applied to roof PVs. The impacts are not the same, of course, but PV panels on the roof are not the same thing as on the ground. There's a big difference, if only in terms of cost. Thomas, you want to add something to that? Is the ADEME doing studies on it? No, we don't have many, because the idea is that if we go on the roofs, we're not on the ground, and therefore we avoid the main impacts. But we're starting to think with my colleague about that, about whether we cannot combine vegetal roofs and PV panels. So this is rather technical. We must manage the water because we need water for the vegetal roof to grow. So how can we create biodiversity on roofs? That's the big question. So I have a comment. Hello, Demi Fonsi, coordinator of the Garrigue Sentinels. We have 3,000 hectares in the Gare region, and the prescriptions are not observed, and the studies are biased. Does anyone want to answer that comment? No. No reaction. So what studies? I don't know. I imagine the studies we're talking about, probably they're from engineering offices. But if we set off from that sort of principle, I don't think there's a lot of room for discussion. But I read it. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next part on monitoring measurements. How can we make sure that all of these measures are applied? And I will begin with Thomas from the ADEME. Do these measures change every year? I think the ADEME is preparing an overview. Yes, we don't have any capitalization at the national level of the measures that are recommended in impact studies. So we asked the Natural History Museum to draw up this overview. So they're looking at all of the impact studies, to gather them together, to look at the different measures that are proposed, and then to train artificial intelligence, which will allow us to continuously screen these things and monitor evolution. So that's currently underway. And there's a big gap there in our knowledge, because I imagine that if we can create a reference, then we can pass this on to the engineering officers who can propose better practices. Then there's a second challenge, but maybe I'm jumping the gun a bit with regard to what you're saying. We need to assess the efficiency also of these measures. Doing scientific monitoring and publishing it takes 4 or 5 years if all goes well. So what we're trying to do with the OFB is harmonize monitoring between developers and operators so that they can then value this data. So they have to follow a common protocol and framework, which is robust. So this work is underway, and the idea is that as from next year, we will be able to produce something. Thank you, Robin. France Renouvelable, who is controlling the proper application of these measures? How can we make sure that the monitoring is done properly? So to make sure that the measures proposed are implemented throughout the life of the farm, and for a PV farm, it's about 30 years. It's the responsibility of the operator of the PV farm. And therefore, the engineering office also that does the monitoring measurements. Then there can be checks by the DTA, the DRIAL, to make sure that the measures are implemented. Then there is a compensation measures that must respect a certain number of criteria of efficiency throughout their life, and that's the responsibility of the operator. Hence the importance of planning and reasoning in the long term with regard to measurements. So for me, for all of the development projects, there's a problem of adaptation of measures to climate change. When the measures that we take for the measures that we use, or the measurements that we use for a PV farm today should be valid for 30 years. So this is a subject that we'll be looking at the beginning of the year, because we must be able to plan for measurements that adapt to climate change. And generally speaking, for the measures to be effective, everybody must contribute, because for agri-photovoltaic PVs, we need to kind of update the fire regulations about the brushlands surrounding the farms, but at the same time there are legal obligations which require you to set up buffer zones for the wildlife. So how do we conciliate this? And the agricultural departments and the heritage department, because we're asked to do archaeological excavations on the work site, so we dig trenches, and great. So then we have to also remember that photovoltaic PV is not the biggest harm for wildlife. We saw that for the insects there was a slight decrease, I think a bit less when we spray product to destroy the insects, but we also have to place these measures in perspective with the other impacts and where PV can also be a benefit. We were talking about this with agri-photovoltaism. There are cases where, thanks to PV, we can implement measures in the field which at the beginning were the forgotten relatives of biodiversity. So you explain to us, when you go and find farmers and you lead them to implement environmental measures, and we explain it all to them, and that we can cope with the entire agro-environmental system, it's very beneficial on a daily basis. Thank you. Manon, Biotop. How does Biotop monitor the implementation of the measures? Is there a specific protocol to guarantee that for 30 years everything goes well? Yes, well, It will start by monitoring the worksite, which is the first step to see whether the measures written in the prefectural authorization are respected. And we act on the front line, and that's very important. And it will allow this first step to redirect certain measures, because as Sophie said, sometimes what we write in the impact study and then what we find in the field, we said, oh no, that won't work. And so I've already been in the situation where I had to review certain measures, in particular with regard to invasive species, where in the prefectural authorization, they'd recommended that we put in a copse of a particular invasive plant. So from a financial and efficiency of the measure and to the context of where the tap was, it was not necessary to remove everything. So we revisited this measure with the project bearer, and we took into account, we respected the prefectural order by taking into account this invasive species, but we only managed the roots and not the adult plants because there was no interest. So in Biotop, we really try to harmonize all of this, all of our worksite reports. We try to really monitor the measures, and it's very important, even for us as an engineering office, to understand everything that's happening in each agency. Therefore, we've created a worksite monitoring app that we developed this year, and we're starting to implement in order to facilitate feedback on experience. And regarding the protocols, there is no national protocol. It's not as constrictive as for wind turbines with a monitoring of mortality, but in the first 5 years we have a focus, and then every 10 years up until the end of the life of the farm. So that's a recommendation of the DRIL. But we have no protocol. So the ADEM and everything are working on this. And in Biotop, we are part of the biodiversity, which is striving to harmonize all of this monitoring in order to more concretely assess the impact of photovoltaic farms. And in 20 years, will you still be there? Well, I don't know where I'll be in 20 years' time. But the engineering office will be there to check that it works. And it is important to talk among engineering offices and research and program organizations, because we always have to keep up to date, because we're talking about living beings, and therefore we cannot always predict with climate change. And we have to learn to juggle everything. Ceratop, you talked about Ceratop. So the question is it open to everyone or only to Biotop teams? It's open to Biotop teams, but it's for the project bearers. Thomas, the ADEM, where do we stand in terms of the monitoring of measures to reduce or compensate impacts with regard to ADEM and monitoring? That's what I was saying. For the time being, we don't have a national database where we have an overview of reduction measures. We did an initial piece of work where we looked at where the PV farms were in France with regard to the natural environment and protected areas. So we have these elements. And in the past, so statistically, there is a difference. Is there more than what? No, I'm not sure if I'm being clear here. If we kind of are they in protected areas? So there is a. They avoid the protected areas, generally speaking. And we do the same thing for habitats. So for time being, the work is underway, but for the protected areas, the results were published 2 weeks ago. And we're continuing this work. And we're looking at what there is in the impact surveys with regard to the measures. I can't yet give you the results. We will be publishing this next year. For the time being, we've studied 100 or so impact surveys, and we hope to have a wider, broader panel than that. But we already see some main trends. Well, to be followed. And do you have a final point? Yes. I wanted to come back to the question of monitoring. It's important to very quickly harmonize this monitoring and that it be in the most general manner possible. So for the time being, everybody does what they want. It's very difficult to use the information or try to identify any trends if we only have one farm with monitoring or dozens of farms. We need to have about 100 to be able to define trends and to see which size of the park and with which inter-row size is more favorable to biodiversity than others. So we need to have farms that follow common protocols, and we won't have the results in 10 years' time. But if we can implement this monitoring quickly, we will have some initial results in 5, 6, or 7 years. Thank you. Well, if you have any questions, then please do write them in on the app, or you can raise your hand. Final question to look forwards to 2027. Robin, France Renouvelable, is currently organizing a congress on photovoltaics and biodiversity for the spring of 2027. Is that right? Maybe you can say a few words about this. What is the objective of this congress? Yes, so far we organized events that were very Franco-French. And last September in Montpellier, we organized the 8th edition of the Conference on the Renewable Energies and Life Impacts, Conference on Wind Turbines and Biodiversity that we co-organized with Biotop in Montpellier in the Quorum. And we brought together more than 1,000 people from the industry and scientists, etc., to share our feedback on experiences. And as we prepared this event, we realized that there was not the same event for PVs, and so we decided to do this. So France Renouvelable is looking after the logistics side of the event, and there'll be an independent scientific committee that will develop the program and issue the call for abstracts from scientists across the world. So we're currently doing the work and setting up the International Scientific Committee, and this will take place between the autumn of 2026 and the spring of 2027. We will soon announce the date and the place. In France, we'll have the first edition, and then we'll see what happens afterwards. We saw that the CWW, which was a small event, has become a big event because in France we had more than 1,000 participants from across the world. And I hope that for photovoltaics, due to the themes that we've talked about today and the needs regarding the knowledge of impacts and the efficiency of measures, I think that we have plenty to do. So, a question on impacts. We're talking about insects of biodiversity, but soil pollution with the foundations, is this not a threat for biodiversity? If it is, are there any alternative solutions? So I mentioned we're talking about solar farm foundations. So do the foundation and solar farms threaten biodiversity? If yes, are there alternative solutions? So the question of soils is very important, and it's often forgotten in the impact studies. We first identified pollution. It is no doubt limited with regard to the foundation surface areas. But the first point of vigilance is compaction of soils, because there are lengthy work sites with heavy engines and interventions in phases that are not the most optimal for the importance of soils, in particular during wet periods. And this is something which we often disregard. And a soil that does not work is there will be plants that have difficulty growing. The ecological functions of water regulation will be diminished, and infiltration and less water storage. There are risks of erosion. So we really need to have a point of vigilance on the question of the soil protection regarding compaction, and also maintaining the horizon of the soils. The soil is structured. There's intense activity on the land and organic matter that is available for to feed organisms and fertility. So you need to keep these structures with the layer of organic matter at the surface, always on the surface. You know, we shouldn't dig it up and send it elsewhere in the garden, or dig it under 50 or 60 centimeters down because we've reworked the soil. We need to try to preserve this structure and avoid compaction. But then, of course, we have to look at pollution, but it's not the first impact we identify, especially because we're looking at concrete, so which is inert, which doesn't necessarily leave any pollution behind. I don't really know what the question was really about. But it's an answer. It's concrete. So, a question from Carolyn. Do you have any example of ERC measures with positive feedback verified in construction phases and operation for all species that could be standard practices for all projects?
ERC avec un retour d'expérience positif, vérifié. Oui. Manon?
Entendu toute la.
I didn't understand the whole question, but yes, what we note is that for plant life between the PV farms, there is a positive effect of cutting the grass on the PV farms because it's either wasteland or degraded grasslands, and the fact of cutting the grass to maintain this farm will encourage areas where there are more flowers, especially in the interrows where there is the most light. So this is what we can note. In particular, for the farm that I monitor, we can see that there has been no loss of biodiversity or of plant life, and we even tend to see habitats that are in better states than before, thanks to this grass cutting. Are there any questions? You can also raise the hand. Maybe I can add to this also. We do have some good feedback on experience from certain farms, and management is really key. We work with sheep pasture land, and so we don't really need to cut the grass. But there are big problems of overpasturing because, for animal farmers, that's how they earn their money, and so they need a troop that is a herd that is adapted to their lifestyle. So in these PV farms where the plants are left to grow until September, it allows the biodiversity to develop. So we, in Photosol, we have left some flowery strips because there's another challenge of the risk of fire and shade that we have to control. So if we can leave a few 100 square meter patches, it will allow biodiversity to repopulate these areas. Last year, the CNRS was specifying that budgets for research were insufficient or very low. Have there been any changes at that level with a real awareness? Romain? Yes. No, we're continuing to support, the ADEME as much as we can. I think, for the past 5 years, ADEME on the AFB have really been trying to funnel help into research to make headway. So we have 1 to 2 million per year. Considering the questions, it would deserve a lot more. So I do encourage all stakeholders to contribute to this. So a researcher in the CNRS has a dotation of several 10,000s of euros to work, and he needs to find projects. Therefore, we must support that work. So in the Gard, 60 or so projects, all in the Garrigue, they don't try to avoid. So what do you do to favor anthropized zones and to avoid, to prevent them, to encourage avoidance? So how do you make sure that they can implement the avoidance measures? I don't know this particular case. I think that this is a follow-on from the former question on the Garrigue. So this, in the impact environmental study, they look at the whole picture. There's always a fear that because we're setting up in a natural environment, that it is rich in biodiversity. It is generally the case, but really need to look case by case. Because for a long time we said, do photovoltaics in wasteland. Wasteland is a plot that was anthropized and had been left as wasteland, and the biodiversity has redeveloped for several months or years, and therefore it's become very rich in biodiversity. So you need to really look closely, case by case. The site which you're looking at, is it very rich in biodiversity? Have the measures of avoidance and the compensation measures, are they adapted? So you can't answer just off the top of your head. There are 60 projects where the measures are not respected. What I would like to say is that we need to trust the environmental engineering office's work, and they know what they're doing, and nobody would have any interest, and this is in the sector of setting up in an area where there's rich biodiversity. Yes, because then you can get, you just have problem after problem afterwards. It's not in the interest of anybody. No PV operator will say we want, whether we want to go into this place where there's a lot of biodiversity. Another question, do you have feedback on recommendations to share with us on the question of how we should assess the impacts of PV farms in wetlands? Any recommendations on assessing the impact in wet zones? Well, there's a research question currently that is investigated by EnerGaïa, which is called EnerGaïa, which studies the impacts of photo PV farms in wetlands and to subsequently propose measures. This program should soon be coming to an end, so I think that we will soon have some information on that. Also, as a complement, in Photosol, we carried out studies with an engineering office on most of the farms we operate. And there are traces of certain things, whatever the context. We can see that the redox traces are there, and they are reformed afterwards. So, what is it? Redox traces? They're reductic traces, the traces that show that the ground is damp. So I just wanted to react to the questions of wetlands. In the Côte d'Or, the DDT systematically demands a water runoff file. It's a new subject that has cropped up since last year or 2 years ago. So before, we were not necessarily taking an interest in this question, but now it is clearly a topic. The instructing departments are asking for more and more in-depth studies. Yes, it's at 3 p.m., but there's a final question, so we might as well answer quickly. Reading the impact surveys of a number of project carriers, the favourable periods for work are variable. Some recommend to begin in August, whereas others recommend October, and to end in February or March. Is there a consensus? Well, to answer, it depends on the relevant species. And of course, if we respected 100% of the wildlife sensitivity calendar, you'd never be able to do your project. So the idea is for the major work, earthwork, etc., in autumn or September, after the period of migration of the birds and the we have to take into account amphibians also. So you need to do the earthwork in the autumn. And once the site is no longer favourable for species, they will have no interest to come back to a naked soil. So we must always continue working on the site so that the wildlife does not grow back or come back during the work. So we need to take that into account. Thank you very much. Yes, very quickly. Yes, it depends where you are in France. The spring doesn't start at the same time in the south of France or in the north, and it also depends on the year. So we must also adapt case by case. There isn't a specific consensus, but we have to adapt. Thank you very much, Thomas Aiglin, Manon, Sophie Jacot, and Thomas Aiglin. Thank you for having followed us until now.